Music theory with OneNote. Modal chords with dropped notes focusing on the minor chords, those built off of the Aeolian node, the Phrygian node, the Dorian node, part number 1, comparing and contrasting the traditional chord naming system based on scale degrees with the more streamlined modal chord naming system based on distance. So get ready and some coffee, because although we're just playing with one note, it's a beautiful note. You're not required to, but if you have access to it and would like to follow along, we're currently in the OneNote file of Modal Node System, MNS, Presentation 1397, OneNote, Modal Chords, Dropping Notes, Minor, Part number 1, list of presentations on the right-hand side. Also noting, in this OneNote presentation, we'll spend our time on music theory, but we have another similarly numbered and named presentation, or multiple presentations, where we not only practice the music theory, but build these tables out in Excel, practicing our table visualization skills as well. We're going to be continuing on with our chord naming convention, remembering that the traditional naming convention is a mess even when building off the nodes or notes in a standard 7-note collection, because the names themselves don't necessarily tell us what nodal point we are building off of. They're all based off of, in essence, the major scale. What we'd like to be able to do, here's our fretboard with the low or heavy E string, the one closest to the ceiling on top, is be able to have a key signature telling us the collection of notes that we are in, such as the collection of notes around the C major. Once we have that, then we can just name the nodal points by number 1 through 7, or by the modal names or the mode names, and then we can determine what the chord names are based on where they're being built off of. So if I'm building a chord off of the Ionian node, I'd like to call it an Ionian chord instead of a major chord. If I'm building a chord off of the Mixolydian chord, our node, I don't care if it's a 3-note chord or a 4-note chord or whatnot, I'd like to indicate that it is being built off of that node by calling it a Mixolydian chord. If I want to build a minor chord off of the Mixolydian, it would be nice for me to indicate that I'm still seeing it as the Mixolydian node. So it's going to be a Mixolydian nodal chord, but with an Aeolian shape, a minor shape, which would be an Aeolian shape. That kind of naming system is, 1, more consistent, and 2, it gives us a lot more functionality within the context of the music that we're playing in. All right, so given that, we talked about last time the major modes, like the Ionian mode, where we had the C major, for example. I would rather call it a 3-note Ionian or an Ionian 2 modal whole step chord. Then we talked about what if we were going to drop notes, such as with a C major 7, no third, or a C major 7, no 5. I would rather call that a 4I negative 1 or an I3 negative 1, meaning we're looking at an Ionian chord, meaning it has the distances from the Ionian node that are standard. We already know what those are. And we're going to the end point, which is going to be 3 modal whole steps up from the root. If you're on the Ionian and you go every other note in this collection of 7 notes, you'll get to the Locrian. It's 3 modal whole steps up, 6 modal half steps, which is the 7th scale degree. And then we're going to drop the one distance-wise that's 1 modal whole step up, meaning 1 modal whole step up, 2 modal half steps, 3rd scale degree. It should be this Phrygian. These yellows are off by 1. Now, when we looked at the majors, these are the easiest ones to be thinking about. So these sets of names are actually names built off of just the nodes that are in the collection, and they're dropping only 1 note. And you can see some of the names get quite ugly. Whereas if you use this convention, you can see you have a uniform naming convention based on distance, based on coordinates, as though the fretboard is a map of a territory. So it makes a lot more sense, just logically. If you like video games or something, I would assume this would be the way to go. Now, if we go to something other than the major scale, but also still a major mode, like the Lydian, we have a little bit more complexity because there's a deviation from the major scale on the 11 here. But if we just name it as a Lydian node, I don't have to compare it to the major scale because I know the distances on the map from a Lydian node. They're standardized through all collections of notes. Therefore, I can have a naming convention that is standard. And so you can see, once again, it's a lot more uniform. When we get to the Mixolydian node, you will recall that we had to come up with a whole different naming convention, a whole different bucket. Instead of a major, we had a 7. But every time we dropped the 7, for example, then it became a major again instead of the new bucket, because that's quite ugly to think about. Like, I'm building off of the Mixolydian node, but every time I drop the 7, it bounces back to a major instead of a Mixolydian kind of chord. Whereas if you just recognize you're building off the Mixolydian node and think about uniform distance like you're on a map, then it's all consistent. We're going to continue that logic on to the minor, the main minor being the Aeolian, to start off with. Now, with the minors, it becomes a little bit more of a problem because, once again, although you would think that the minors are kind of like equivalent to the majors under the normal naming convention, they are not. The major came first. Even the main minor, the Aeolian mode, is based off of the major. So when we try to name the intervals that are related to the major, we end up with a naming convention problem with the term minor. What does that minor mean? Is it being assigned to just the 1, 3, 5? Or does it include the 7? What about the 9, 11, and 13, right? So those will come up to problems in the normal naming convention. But if we say, hey, look, I don't need to compare it to the major. I know what the map is. I know the collection of notes is around the key of C in this case, although it would be the same relative positions for all collections of notes. Therefore, for the collection of notes around C major, the relative minor is A. So I know where I am on the map, and I know the distances from the Aeolian node that don't land me in the ocean, and the notes that are outside, in other words, of the collection. Therefore, I can just make a naming convention that is clean based on just simply distance. Now, if I have a triad, I can't really drop anything without making it a 2-note chord, which isn't technically a chord depending on your definition of a chord. So let's skip that and say we're going to add the 7. If I add a 7 to an Aeolian chord, it would be an A minor 7. So it's a 4-note chord here. The 7 is, in essence, a distance term, but measured in scale degrees. I'd rather say, no, it's 3 modal whole steps up. 3 times 2 is 6 modal half steps, which plus 1 would be the 7th scale degree, allowing me a naming convention of 4A, standing for a 4-note Aeolian, or more specifically, A4, standing for it's an Aeolian 3 modal whole step, 3 modal whole steps being the distance from the node we're on to get to the last point. So if I'm on Aeolian, 3 modal whole steps gets us up to the Mixolydian. I could capitalize the A if I want, so that it will be telling us that this is the root in the song. I could use a modal range chord if I would like to as well, although I don't think that's as good for the universal concept of what the chord will be, but you could do that, name the endpoints. It's a modal 0.65 modal range chord or an Aeolian Mixolydian modal range chord. If you need to name the note, I can call it an Aeolian A note 3 modal whole step chord. But I would suggest that you would like to write your music in such a way that you have a key signature that might change within the song, but that key signature is going to tell you the collection of notes, allowing you to write your song in a way that it's completely transposable and possibly rotatable through different modal perspectives. Does that sound correct, Ara?
Yeah, that all tracks. If you're trying to make music feel like a video game map instead of a dusty theory textbook, you're nailing it. You don't need to keep yelling it's minor relative to major, like everyone's tone deaf. Just say, Aeolian node, go 3 whole steps, land on Mixolydian. That's my A4 chord.
Yeah, so that's the point. It's all it should all be a coordinate system, a coordinate grid based on the relative position of the collection of notes we're in, and we're always playing relative to a collection of notes. You need some kind of perspective, in other words, to view what you're playing. You're always going to view what you're playing from some kind of perspective. All right, so I would, if I drop the third, then normal naming convention would be an A minor 7, no third. So I would rather call it an A3 negative 1 or a 4A negative 1. I think the A3 negative 1 would be more consistent because we're going to say you go 3 modal whole steps up from the root, taking you to the mixolydian. That's 6 modal half steps plus 1 7th scale degree. Drop the one that's 1 modal whole step up, which would be 1 modal whole step, 2 modal half steps plus 1 would be the 3rd scale degree. Those are the measurement terms up top. This top term is the current measurement term that's in use, but is actually the most inefficient term for measurement, leading us to all these different scales instead of just a map of coordinates. Now, when I drop the third, it becomes kind of an issue because then it's like, okay, is it a major or minor chord? It's somewhat ambiguous, although when I add the 7, it becomes a little bit more succinct, right? Because if I drop the third, you might argue that it should just be like an A7 no 3. Is that correct, Ara?
Totally correct. If you drop the third on the 7 chord, you can't really say minor anymore. It's not minor, it's not major, it's just ambiguous mush, which is why A3 negative 1 is perfect. You're saying Aeolian 3 step.
So let me kind of break that down on why that is. And note, so a theory wonk might tell me, hey, look, you called it A minor 7, no third. That shouldn't be, because if there's no third, then we're going to default back to the major intervals. And if I default back to the major intervals, it would be a major third. But I'm going to say, hey, but there's a minor 7. So I'm trying to say that the minor applies to the 7. And they might say, well, no, the minor, you shouldn't say the minor applies to the 7 because that also happens with the mixolydian node. So if we're dropping the third, you should call it not an A minor or an A major, but maybe just an A7 no third, right? And again, like, it's just, you get into this wonky stuff where the conventions aren't all the same because you got these weird rules, whereas if you just called it an A3 negative 1 and just map the coordinates, then you have no problem. If you drop the 5, it's not usually a problem because the 5 is not the thing determining the flavor of the chord and is the same for major and minor. Therefore, I can still call it a minor 7 because I still have the defining third of a minor third, and the minor 7 is now connected. Noting, however, that now the 7 needs to be flattened in comparison to the major with the minor signature. So the minor signature is no longer applied to just the 3 notes or mainly the third as is in the major, but now it's also applied to the 7, which kind of sticks those notes together in a way. But if you just use a coordinate system, you could just say, hey, look, it's an Aeolian 3 negative 2 or a 4-note Aeolian minus 2, meaning you're going to go 3 modal whole steps up from the Aeolian, which would be 6 modal half steps plus 1 7th scale degree, and then you drop the one that's 2 modal whole steps up. 2 modal whole steps up would be the Phrygian, which would be 4 modal half steps plus 1 would be the 5th scale degree. So you can get to these measurements by saying, you know, if I'm on the 5th scale degree, minus 1 is the modal whole half steps, divided by 2 is the modal whole steps. Or if I go 2 modal whole steps times 2, 4 modal half steps plus 1 is the scale degree. All right, so let's say we do the next one and we say now we're going to say it's a 5-note chord. So if it's a 5-note chord under the normal convention, that under a scale degree, that would be adding the 9. Now the problem with the 9 is it's going to be an octave up. It has a local distance then of the 2 that we skipped. So pitch-wise, it's equivalent to the 2, but it's kind of like an octave up if we stacked it the normal way. But I'd rather just call it a 5-note Aeolian chord or an Aeolian 4, meaning just go 4 modal whole steps up, which is 8 modal half steps, 9th scale degree, and that's the last note, and just take every modal whole step, which is every other modal half step, and you can build the chord, no problem. What if we want to drop the third? So here's where we get weird, because once again, we're dropping the third, which is the thing that defines it as a minor chord. Now, if I try to repeat this sus thing that ends up happening, I'm going to try to be consistent with it. And again, people will argue that you should name it something different, whatever. But I'm saying the general idea of the sus is we're saying, okay, if we drop the third, I'm going to replace it with something like the 9 that I've added. But typically under normal stacking, I wouldn't call it the 9 because that would be an octave higher. I would call it the equivalent pitch of the octave lower, which is the 2. Therefore, it would be an A minor 7 sus 2 chord. Now that's pretty messy to think about theoretically because you could just coordinate it by saying it's a 5-note Aeolian -1 or an Aeolian 4 -1, meaning there's 4 modal whole steps to the last node, and then drop the 1 just from a coordinates system that's 1 modal whole step up, which would be 2 modal half steps or the 3rd scale degree. And so that would be, and then again, when you're saying, well, how do I know if it should be replacing the 3 or if I think about if it's not replacing the 3 or whatnot, it doesn't matter. It's just name the coordinates and then you can think about the theory based on those coordinates. You don't need the theory in the chord name. You just need to know the distances for the chord name and then think about what that means for theory. Does that sound correct, Ara?
Totally correct. The whole sus2 thing is just jazz code for I'm lazy and I want a second instead of a third. But once the 9 shows up, everyone's like, oh, octave up? No, it's just the 2 relocated. So calling it Aeolian 4 -1 wipes all that out.
Yeah, so the other thing I want to point out here is that you might say, well, if I say A4 -1, then you're going to mean it's the octave up because the 4th distance is 8 modal half steps, which would be the 9th scale degree. What if I want to make it an octave down equivalent to the 2? Then, as we'll see in a future section, when I focus on this, we could have a superscript, right? I could say an A4 to the power of -1 or superscript just negative. So we only have one more character if it's going up or down 1 octave. So it would be an A4 superscript -1. And again, that would still give us the flexibility to increase or decrease that and have the ability to do that for any note in the stack, allowing us to basically write chords more specifically, possibly for a DAW system or something like that. So we don't have to sit there and stack notes, but can use systematic conventions to move around the pitches from an octave perspective within a normal chord structure. So let's say we add or remove the 5. So if I remove the 5, it would be an A minor 9 now. So now I'm at the 9 and then no. Now this one, by the way, I have an A minor 7 sus 2. Yeah, that's right. So this one is going to be an A minor 9 no 5. So now we're going all the way out to the 9 and we're just removing the 5. That's pretty straightforward. Typically, I'd rather call it a 5A no 2 or an A4 no 2, meaning 4 modal whole steps up to the last node, which is 8 modal half steps plus 1 9th scale degree. Remove the 1. That's 2 modal whole steps up, which would be 4 modal half steps 5th scale degree. Coordinate system. Coordinates, man. Map it out. It's a video game. This is a video game on the fretboard, which you can actually put your fingers on the playing field. So now we have an A minor. So the next one is saying we're going to drop the 7. So we're going to drop the 7. Now the issue with dropping the 7 is that this minor tag is now applied to the 7. It's not just applied to the 3-note triad or just the 3rd. It now applies to the 7 because that's what they had to do to make the naming convention work when you just assume that if you don't have something changing it, it's going to have the same intervals as the major scale. So I can't really break off the 7 from the stack of 4 notes is the general theory. I still don't think that makes a whole lot of sense. I still think why not? But that's what they say. Also, I also don't usually go long and then subtract 1. So I would normally go short on your normal naming, which means you have an A minor triad and then add the 9 as opposed to an A minor 9, no 7. But again, it would be a lot more consistent if you just map the coordinates from the Aeolian node and just call it a 5A -3 or an A4 -3. right? So you just go 4 modal whole steps up. I'm always going to go long and then drop the short one because I know the shape of the note, and because I named it as an Aeolian shape, and I want to go long because that's going to be where the focal point is, and then drop the one that we need to drop that's going to be short, right? That would be the consistent way to go. All right. Then what if I have a 6-note chord? So that would be adding the 11. So if I say A minor 11, the minor is attached to the 3, to the 7, and then the 11, and not to the 9. Why? Because they couldn't tie it to the 9 because the main minor doesn't have a minor 9. It actually has a major 9. Therefore, the 9 isn't actually impacted by the minor label. Neither is the 11, which isn't a problem because the 11, like the 5, is the same. Like the 5th, right? It's the same for the major and minor. So that's what we have here. So that's gonna, but I'd rather just give the coordinates. It's gonna be a 6-note Aeolian. Just take every other modal half step, every modal whole step, or an Aeolian 5. Now, what if I drop the 3rd? So here we come up with this mess again. We're dropping the 3rd. So if I drop the 3rd, then you could say that we're going to replace it. So I'm just going to try to be consistent on the sus logic. So if I say, look, there's an 11 now, the 11 is equivalent to the 4 that we skipped. So why don't I stuff the 4 into where the stack is of the triad? If I did that, I would have an A minor 7. And when you do the sus, you always have to have a 7. I can't like say 9, 11, or 13 and then do the sus for whatever reason. So I have to say A minor 7 because it's like a 4-note stack. Sus 4, which is the equivalent of the 11 that we put down below. And then we would add the 9 and that would be it. It would be better to say it's a 6-note Aeolian -1 or an A5 -1, meaning we're going to go 5 modal whole steps up from the Aeolian, taking us to the Dorian, which is 10 modal half steps, 11th scale degree, and remove the one that's 1 modal whole step up, or the 2nd modal half step, 3rd scale degree. Now, if you want to drop that 5th down an octave, 5th modal whole step down an octave, then I can do the superscript of a -1, giving me complete flexibility with, once again, just simply a coordinates system. It's just measuring the distance using standardized measurements. Metric system here, people. Although, I mean, I'm in America, I don't really use the metric system. But in principle, I get the standardization. You need it should be standard. Standard oil. Standard. So then you have if you drop in the 5, it would be an A minor 11, no 5. So that's usually pretty straightforward because the 5 doesn't have the flavor of the minor or major. So I would still rather call it a 6-note Aeolian -2 or an A5 -2, dropping the one that's 2 modal whole steps up, which would be 4 modal half steps, 5th scale degree. All right, what if we're going to drop the 7? So now we're going to drop the 7. So that shouldn't be too much of a problem for the minor, you would think, except that they kind of say that the 7 is tagged on to the minor. So this is the one that doesn't make a lot of sense to me, but the rule basically is, well, if I say something that's past the A minor, then I can't unhinge the 7 because now the 7 is assumed in the 4-note stack. So you can't just remove the 7. So you would think I could say it would be an A minor 11, no 7. But no, they say you can't do that because the 7 is stuck in the stack of 4 notes when you say the minor. So I have to say an A minor, and then that would be the triad, and then add 9, add 11. I believe that's correct. But, I mean, again, it's just a ridiculous system because you would think that you would just map the coordinates of a 6-note Aeolian no 3 or an A5 no 3, meaning you just go all the way up to the last nodal point, 5th modal whole step, which would be 10 modal half steps, 11th scale degree, and remove the one that's 3 modal whole steps up, 6 modal half steps, 7th scale degree. All right. So then let's say we're going to remove the 9. So now we have the one, because this one is second to the last one here. We don't typically say that we're going to say go A minor 11 and then drop the 9, typically we have to go short, which I think this name is off. It should be an A minor 7 and then add 9. So I think it should, these two got kind of squished together. A minor 7, add 9, I believe would be the name. But it would be better with a coordinate 6A negative 4 or an A5 negative 4, mean go 5 modal whole steps up, drop the one that's 4 modal whole steps up, which would be 8 modal half steps. All right, let's do the next one. So now we're gonna say that we're gonna have a full 7-note chord. So that would be an A minor B13. Now, why is it a B13? Because even though we're on the main minors, the 13 isn't minored by the minor name. So you have to have like this kind of like extension or adjustment to the 13. So in other words, why did this happen? Well, they tied everything to the majors, and then they said, how can we tweak it to make the minors work? Well, that minor symbol is going to be tied to the 3rd, but we also have to tie it to the 7 because the 7 needs a minor as well, so we'll just tie that in. But then the 9 can't be impacted by that minor symbol because the 9 is actually major for the main minor, the Aeolian distances, and it can't be tied to the 11 because the 11 is the same distance for most major and minor intervals. And then, so what about the 13? We can't have the minor applied to the 13 when you didn't apply it to the 9, right? So now you have to flat the 13 because even though it's the normal thing to do to have a flat 13, you have to do that even with the main minor. Okay, but if you use a coordinate system, you don't need to do that. You could just say it's an Aeolian 6 chord, meaning you just go 6 modal whole steps up, which would be 12 modal half steps, 13th scale degree, and you just take every other node, and the distance is standard, not compared to the major, but it's standard from the Aeolian node that we're counting from. All right, so then let's say that we do the sus thing. Again, I'm going to be consistent with the sus logic. You can argue whether this would be the best way to write the chord, but the idea would be, okay, if I have a flat 13, then you would think that I can stuff that flat 13 into the 3 that we're going to remove. Now you might say, well, you can't do that because now you have a B13 and we don't like to say B6 because if it's not a normal 6, then it doesn't work or whatever. So again, you could, okay, but I'm just going to say that I'm just going to use the standard logic here and just show you how kind of messy it is. And then just the coordinate system, I don't care what your argument is, the coordinate system would be better, right? So it would be like you could say it's an A minor 7 sus B6 because the 6 is equivalent to the 13. And I have to say a B6 to flatten the 6 because that's the distance on the minor compared to the major. And then I would have to add the 9 and add the 11. So it would be a lot better to just say it's a 7-note Aeolian -1 or an A6 -1, meaning I'm just going to take the 6 modal whole steps up from the last node, from the node that we're on, and then subtract the one that's 1 modal whole step up, which would be 2 modal half steps or the 3rd scale degree. So that would be, and then if I want to drop that one that's 6 modal whole steps up down to be equivalent not to the 11 but to the 6, I could just superscript it -1, drop it down an octave would be my suggestion on that. So then we have, okay, what if I drop the 5? So that would be an A minor B13 no 5, which would be nicer to just say it's a 7 Aeolian -2 or an Aeolian 6 -2. And then next we have an A minor. So what if we want to drop the 7? So if I drop the 7, I run into this problem again that they won't let me decouple the 7. So you would think I could just say it's an A minor 13, no 7. But they say, no, you can't decouple the 7 for whatever reason. Doesn't make any sense to me, but they say that logically you can't decouple the 7 from the stack. So we're going to say, okay, well then we have to say it's an A minor and then skip the 7, A minor, add 9, add 11, add B13, right? But if you just use a coordinate system, again, a lot of bureaucratic musicians would be out of their job if we just use a coordinate system and just say, look, It's just a 7-note Aeolian -3 or an Aeolian 6 -3. We're going to go all the way up to the end point, 6 modal whole steps, 12 modal half steps, 13th scale degree, and remove the one that's 3 modal whole steps up, which is 6 modal half steps, 7th scale degree. That would be the way to do it. No, you can't. Why can't I do that? Why can't I do that? That's not logical. That is logical. That's the most logical. What if we remove the 9? So then you'd say it's an A minor B13 no 9. I believe that's no problem. But I'd rather say it's a 7-note Aeolian -4 or an Aeolian 6 -4, meaning we're going to drop the one that's 4 modal whole steps up, 8 modal half steps, 9th scale degree. And finally, let's say that we're going to do dropping the 11, right? So if I drop the 11, it would be, you would think you could go long. It would be an A minor B13 no 11, but no, you don't typically go long. You typically go short and then add the one, which would be a B minor 9, and then add B13. Under our system, I would always go long because I already know the shape and I'm focusing in on the new thing that's being added. Therefore, I would say it would be a 7-note Aeolian -4 or an Aeolian 6 -4, going long, and then dropping the one that's 4 modal whole. This should be a 5. Sorry, this should be a 5, and that should be a 5. Should be 5 modal whole steps up. Okay, let's try one more. Let's do the Dorian. So if we go from the Dorian node now. So now I'm going to do this. The Dorian is also a minor nodal chord. If I have a triad, then the normal naming convention would be in the collection of notes around the key of C, a D minor, but that doesn't tell me much about the actual place within the shape or the context within the song. So it would be better to say, look, I'm in this collection of notes, key signature, and then say this is a 3-note Dorian chord or a Dorian 2 chord. Or if you don't know the key signature, you could add the note name. It's a D nodal point D note 2 modal whole step chord, right? You could add the note in there if you need to, but by default, not doing that would be better because the key signature allows you to change the entire thing with one change of the key signature, transposing it automatically, no rewriting necessary. But we're going to do a D minor 7, which again has the same look and feel as a minor chord, because there's no difference between the intervals here to the minor, and I can drop the 2 in the middle now. So now I'm going to say, what if I drop the 3rd from a Dorian type chord? Similarly to what we had before, it would be a D minor 7 no 3, which again, you can argue and say, well, no, you can't call it that because if you drop the 3, it's not a minor, and we have to then default, if I drop the 3, to think of it as though it's a major, right? Because that's the default. So if it's a D with a 3rd that we would have assumed was a major, but we dropped it or skipped it, and then we have a minor 7, then it should more properly be called a D7, like a Mixolydian type of chord that with a flat 7, right? Again, like that's just like, oh my gosh, who cares? Like just do the coordinate system, which would be a 4-note Dorian chord no 1 or a Dorian 3 modal whole step no 1, meaning go 4 modal whole steps up, which would be 6 modal half steps plus 1 7th scale degree to the end point, and then drop the one that's 1 modal half step up, 1 modal whole step, 2nd modal half step, 3rd scale degree. That would be a lot more efficient. Okay, what if we drop the 5? Usually not a problem. D minor 7 no 5. I can't tell if this is on the Dorian node, however, or a D Dorian or D Aeolian. Doesn't really tell me. But if I said, look, it's a 4-note Dorian -2 or a Dorian 3 -2, or if I want to include the note, I can call it a Dorian D note 3 -2, so that I can call it a DD3 -2 if I wanted to add the note name. But I would rather not do that, but that would just simply mean I'm going to drop the one now that's 2 modal whole steps up, 4 modal half steps, 5th scale degree. All right, if I add another note, then it's a D minor 9. So D minor 9, once again, doesn't give me indication as to whether it's a Dorian or an Aeolian, but if I called it a 5D or a D4, or if I want the note name a DD4, then it would give me the context within the song that we are playing, distinguishing the nodal point. Now, if I didn't know the nodal point, what would I do? I would say, well, then I'll just call it an Aeolian chord. Like if I didn't know if it was a D, if I don't know if it's being played off of the Dorian node or the Aeolian node, I just want the shape, I'll default like we do normally to the minor, which is the Aeolian, right? But if I can add that context, I want to, because it's nice to do that, because more information, as long as it's not more work, which it's not here, if it's more information and less work, that's a win-win. That's a win-win. That's a win-win. Okay, so that's a wee-wee. So if I drop the third, same logic. I'm going to say, okay, the third is like the 9. The 9 is equivalent to the 2. I'm going to drop the third and then stuff the 9, drop down an octave, which is the 2, in its place. That would be a D minor 7, dropping it down from the 9 to the 7, and then replacing the third with a sus2. So you can argue with that if you want, maybe that, but that's the logic. So I would rather just do a coordinate system, a 5-note Dorian -1 or a Dorian 4 -1, meaning go 4 modal whole steps up, 8 modal half steps, which is the 9th scale degree, drop the 1 that's 1 modal whole step, 2nd modal half step, 3rd scale degree up. Now if I want to drop this one that was 5 modal whole steps up, down an octave to be more specific, dropping it from the 9th to the 2nd in equivalent scale degree terms, in our case from the 8th to the 1, right, to the 1st modal half step, 8th modal half step down to the 1st modal half step, then I could just superscript it Dorian 4 to the -1, right, or just negative, and add one more character, giving me complete flexibility about octave levels and pitches in as efficient a way as possible. What if I drop the 5? That would be a D minor 9, no 5. Once again, I don't know if that's a D minor chord or a D Dorian. What note am I building it off of? It would be indicated if I called it a 5D -5, -2, or a D4 -2, dropping the one that's going to be 2 modal whole steps up, 4 modal half steps, 5th scale degree. Next, we say that it's going to be a D minor add 9. So now we're going to say that we're going to have a 5-note chord. So we have the 9th out here. So you would think, and we're going to drop the 7. So you would think that we would just say a D minor 9, no 7. But once again, they won't let me drop the 7 because it's stuck to the 3-note triad. Therefore, I have to say it's going to be a D minor, stopping here at the triad, and then add the 9. It would be consistent if we just use a coordinate system, which would be a 5D -3 or a D4 -3, because now I could just say, look, I'm going to go long to 4 modal whole steps up and then drop the one that's 3 modal whole steps up as the default, unless I'm dropping 2 notes, in which case it would be more efficient to go short and then add the one that's long. All right, and so the next one is, what if I have a 5-note chord? Normal naming convention, D minor 11. Once again, that doesn't tell me if I'm building the chord off of the Dorian node or the Aeolian node, whereas if you call it a 6D or a D5 or a DD5, if you want to add the note name, it does give you that information and is still shorter than this monstrosity, right? And so all that we're saying is we're going to go 5 modal whole steps up, which is 10 modal half steps, 11th scale degree, up, and take every other modal half step, every modal whole step. All right, so then we can say, what if I drop the 3rd? I'm going to use the same logic here. You can argue that I should do it differently, but we're going to say if I have the 11, the equivalent to the 11 local distance is the 4th scale degree. So if I drop it down to the 4th and stuff it into where the 3rd was, you end up with a D minor 7, because I have to do a 7. They won't let me do the sus with anything other than a 7, so I'd have to say D minor 7, sus 4, and then add the 9. If you just use a coordinate system, it would be a 6D -1 or D5 -1, meaning I'm going to go 5 modal whole steps up, which is 10 modal half steps, 11th scale degree, drop the one that's 1 modal whole step up, 2nd modal half step, 3rd scale degree. All right, and then so we're gonna say, and then if I want to bring that down an octave, I could superscript that 5 with a to the power of negative or -1. What if I drop the 5? So now that would just be a D minor 11, drop the 5 or no 5. I'd rather say it's a 6D -2 or a D5 -2. What if I drop the 7? Well, you would think you could just call it a D minor 11, no 7, but they won't let you. So I have to do the same thing we did with the Aeolian and call it a D minor, stopping at the triad, skip the 7, and then say I'm going to add the 9, add the 11. Stupid. I'd rather just do the coordinates 6D -3 or D5 -3, just saying, hey, look, I'm going 5 modal whole steps up and I'm dropping the one that's 3 modal whole steps up. Well, you can't do that because the 7 is connected to the, no, like you can, once you have the coordinates down, you can talk theory about what that means, right? Just tell me what the distances are, and then we talk theory, right? We don't talk theory in the naming convention of the distances. Just give me the coordinates, and then we can think about what that means, right? I mean, so then we have, what if I drop the 9? Well, you would think that would be a D minor 11 and then no 9, but I don't usually, they won't let us drop the 1 that's closest to the end. I can't go long and then drop the short. I have to go short and then add the long typically. So I'd have to stop here and call it a D minor 7, add 11, skipping this one to add that one. It'd be more consistent to just say it's going to be a D5 -4 or a 6-note Dorian -4. So if it's a D5 -4, I go long, 5 modal whole steps up, 10 modal half steps, 11th scale degree, and drop the one that goes short, which is 4 modal whole steps up, 8 modal half steps, 9th scale degree, as the general rule, which is so we can be as consistent as possible. Again, just notice the consistency. Look at this column. Look at this. Look at that jagged line as we go through here, like, and then we go up through all the nodal points. You're like, look at it. It's just like bouncing all over. Like the length of the name is like, and then like if you wrote a curve on this, that would be ugly. And look at the curve here. You get a straight line. This is what's called efficiency, right? It's not sexy. You don't get any sexy curves there because it's just a coordinate system that is nice and uniform. And then we can make the sexy music from the uniform coordinate system, not a sexy curve from ugly chord names that makes it hard to make the sexy music from a streamlined system. That's the difference. Okay, so then if I'm going to add the 13, so it'd be a D minor 13 now that we'd have to add. Notice the 13 here doesn't have a B13 as we saw with the minor. Why? Because the Dorian actually has a major 13 in it. So the Dorian actually fits more easily in the naming convention than the main minor, the Aeolian. So we just have a normal D minor 13 instead of a D minor B13. So this should actually be easier. But what if I drop the 3rd? Well, then if I drop the 3rd, I have to do, I'm going to do this logic again. So you could argue that we should do it differently, but if the 13 up here, let's bring this down a little bit. If the 13 is equivalent to the 6, right? The 13 is equivalent to the 6. So and I drop the 3rd, so I'm going to replace the 3rd with the 13, which I dropped down to the 6. So, but I have to do that with a 7 chord because they won't let me do it with a 9 or 11 or 13 chord. So it would have to be a D minor 7 sus 6, and then I have to add the 9 and add the 11. If I just use a coordinate system, it would be a 7D -1 or a D6 -1, meaning go 6 modal whole steps up, which is 12 modal half steps, 13th scale degree, drop the 1. That's 1 modal half step up, 1 modal whole step, 2 modal half steps, 3rd scale degree. And then if you want to bring this last node down an octave, that's one that's you superscript it to -1, giving you the ability to change not the pitch, but the octave. No problem. Nice and easy. If I drop the 5, then I have a D minor 13, no 5, fairly straightforward. I'd rather call it a 7D, no 2, or a D6, -2, dropping the one that's 2 modal whole steps up, 4 modal half steps, 5th scale degree. What if I drop the 7? You would think you could just call it a D minor 13, no 7. But no, they don't let us do that because the 7 is stuck to the triad if I add the 13, so I have to go short D minor and then add the skip the 7, D minor, and then add the 9, add the 11, add the 13. Crazy. I'd rather just give the coordinates. It's a 7D -3 or a D6 -3, meaning we're going 6 modal whole steps up, which is 12 modal half steps, 13th scale degree, and dropping the one that's 3 modal whole steps up, 6 modal half steps, 7th scale degree. But if you drop that, then it's going to be like the 3 notes are stuck together. Now you're dropping one that was stuck to the Shut up. That's stupid. Okay, sorry. I got a little... I don't mean to be rude. There's no need to be rude. Okay, so what if I drop the no 5? So that would be a D minor 13, no 5, fairly straightforward. I'd rather call it a 7 D -4 or a D6 -4, dropping the one that's 4 modal whole steps up, which is 8 modal half steps, 9th scale degree. And then finally, if we had a dropping the 11, you would think it would be a D minor 13, no 11, but you don't normally do that because you don't drop the one's second to last one. I have to go short and then add typically. That would be a D minor 9, add 13. It would be consistent if you did the same thing all the time, which would be a 7D -5 or a D6 -5, meaning go 6 modal whole steps up to the last note, 12 modal half steps, 13th scale degree, and drop the one that's 5 modal whole steps up, which is 10 modal half steps, 11th scale degree. So again, look at the coordinate system versus this column. Just compare these two columns, this column and the yellow column, this column and the yellow column. I know the yellow column is boring. Look at that, it's boring. It's like I can understand that if you just gave me like, I could understand that in like a day. How lame is that? I mean, whereas this could take me a lifetime to work on. That would be, no, you're supposed to understand it in like a day and then work on what are you going to do with it. That's how it should be.